Okay, so these slides and the following few slides is going to give you detailed explanation for some of the concepts we have seen in the flowchart here, right? Or in other words, in the following few slides, so I'm going to give you some backup explanations, right? Let's see what are they. Okay. Private saving. This is disposable income minus consumer spending. Financial market includes banking, stock, and the bond market. So this institute, their role in the economy is to channel private saving and foreign lending into investment spending, government borrowing, and foreign borrowing. Let's go back a little bit. Okay, look at this flow chart to understand the two concepts we just learned. Private saving is households' income coming from here, minus spending, right? So this is private spending, private saving. What is financial market? Financial market essentially is a middleman. They channel the private saving. This is coming from domestic households. And also sometimes there are international savings. And then, so they collect the resource. This resource will be lent out to government or to private business or to foreigners. All right. So this is the financial market. Now look at government. Government spend and borrow, but they may have different reasons, right? So earlier we talked about government transfer. Okay, so but the government transfer is different from government purchase of goods and service. Government transfer, there's no return of goods and service. But government purchase of goods and service, okay? So there are goods and a service will provide to the government. Now let's look at government borrowing. This is a total amount of funds borrowed by federal, state, and local government in the financial market. Okay, so this government borrowing. Now, regarding to international trade, so we have export and import. So export is a good and a service we produced but purchased by other countries or rest of the world. On the other hand, import are good and a service purchased from other countries, or those are the good and service produced by rest of the world, but we purchased. Okay, this is import and export. And finally, so we have inventory and the investment spending. So first look at investment spending. So essentially is what the business spend to expand their business, like purchase physical capitals, machines, construction of new buildings. Okay, and here we also include change to inventory as investment spending. But what is inventory? Inventory is the stock of goods and raw materials held to facilitate business operation. Say, for example, so if we work for bakers, okay, and the bakers, so they have a lot of fresh product put in their warehouse. Why they do that is because So they want to make sure the customer walk into their door, so they have the goods and service they need. And those things is called inventory. It depends on the demand. So those inventory may change. And so this change the inventory, so sometimes we just categorize as investment spending. Okay, give you another example. Apple. Okay, so every year, so they announce new lines of iPhone. Okay, so in order to satisfy the need of the market, they must do some projection. They must produce a bunch of iPhones in advance. But in reality, so the demand may be stronger or may be weaker than they predicted. Let's say, for example, the demand is pretty weak. So they only sold 5 million out of 6 million they produced. And then they have additional 1 million can be sold in the current period. And then, so this 1 million typically, so they add into inventory. And this increase in inventory is called investment spending. Because this 1 million they can use for next year's sale. Other way to understand that is, so Apple is going to purchase 1 million of unsold iPhone from themselves. Okay, so this investment spending. Now, given this preparation and this discussion, I'm going to introduce a formal definition of GDP. So GDP is short for gross domestic product. Okay, and in the definition, there are a few things. Number one, this is total market value. So this refers to growth, market value of all. So this is number one. And then number two, so this is about final goods and service. And the keyword here is final. Okay, so I'm going to explain to you what does final good means. Okay, this is number one. Number two. Now, number three, so this is produced within the country. Okay, within the country. This is number three. The keyword is within the country. Right? So that refers to domestic. And so there are minor things. This says in a year, but certainly we can look at GDP for a quarter, even for a month. Right? And also here, so we said this is a product. This is a good and a service produced within the country. But certainly we can look at good and service produced within a city, like city of Omaha, or within a state, like a GDP for the state of Nebraska or county. But usually, so we look at a GDP within the country. Okay? So this is a definition of GDP. So when I explain to you the flow chart, I give you the idea. So this is like a closed circle. And then, so GDP can be calculated three ways. So either we can look at the total value of all final good and service produced. So this is product approach. Alternatively, we can look at all spendings. And finally, we can look at all income. Okay. Now, for each of these concepts, so there's a tricky part you want to pay attention. In the first approach, final goods. This is what we need to adopt. In the second one, domestically produced. This is what we need to pay attention. But certainly, so this domestic, this is like net domestic, because we also export and we also import. So we need to cancel out. Okay. Lastly, so in terms of product, so this is what we produce in the economy. Okay? So there are three approaches. Now again, so we will see some examples to understand how we calculate GDP, right? So maybe I can skip this one, so we will come back to this later. So let's look at examples. I believe I have examples to calculate GDP. Okay, so let's just first look at this example, and then so I will return to the slides I just skipped. Okay, so read this table. So this table gives us a fictionary economy. In this economy, there are three businesses. Right? So the business number one, they produce oil. Business number two, they produce steel. Business number three, produce vehicle. Okay. Now in this table, so we have the business revenue, business operation for each firm. Okay. Now, given this detailed information, we can apply those three approaches we have just learned to calculate the GDP for this economy. Let's start with the first one. Okay, the first one is the value of value of production of final goods. But what is final goods? Start with the first business. So value of sale essentially is the value of goods they produce. Okay, and what is intermediate goods? Which is the goods they use to produce their goods. But certainly, so they use no intermediate goods. So they just directly extract raw material from the mother nature. Hence, in this business, so the value added is equal to the value of their sales of 4,200. Now, in the second business, so the value of the goods is 9,000. But in order to produce this $9,000 of steel, so they use here, look at here. So they use the ore produced by the first business. Okay, and then, so this is considered as intermediates because this is they purchase from other business, right? So by looking at here, we find out the value added or the final goods. So this second business produce. And similarly, we can look at the third business. Now it goes here. Okay, and we calculate the final goods produced by American Motor is 12,500. Now we add them together. That gives us the value of production. This is the first approach. Second approach, we look at aggregate spending on domestically produced final goods. And towards the end, only the car will go to customer, right? Because all will enter the production of steel, and the steel will enter the production of vehicle. And towards the end, only the car will circulate in the market. Okay, so the first two things, they circulate in the factory market. but the last one circulate in the goods market. So that's the second approach. And then lastly, we can look at income. And here, so we have wage income, interest income, rent, and profit. Okay, so we add all of them together. So that gives us the total income. So this is the third approach. And so with no surprise, this three approach will yield the exact same number. All right. So in next class, so I will go through this example. But I would ask you to review this table to understand this. So then we are prepared for next class. Now let's back to the slides we just skipped. Okay. So yes, we have three approaches. Okay. So first, let me explain to you why they equal to each other. Okay. Spending equal to income, like this background picture shows. So if a gentleman spent $10 for a shave, and then this $10 goes to the barber's pocket, right? So anyone's spending becomes somebody else's income. Okay, so that's why spending equal to income. But so where we are going to spend? We are going to spend on the good and the service we produce. Hence, they will equal to product. Okay, to summarize, these three approaches must yield the same number. Okay, and then a few things I want to highlight. Okay, so this is a typical mistake to understand GDP. So GDP is produced. Okay? So hence GDP measuring production. Sales of used goods is not what we produce this year, not included. Like in this background picture, so this building will not count to this year's GDP because it has already been counted when the year it was built. However, so during the transaction of selling this building, there are services added by the agent, right? By realtors. And then, so the realtors service will be considered as GDP this year. Okay. Or in general, the sales of financial assets, they are not included because financial assets doesn't produce new goods and service. However, whoever offered this service to facilitate the sales of financial assets, that is considered as GDP. Okay. Now the other things about GDP is within the country, right? Only production that take place within the borders of the country is included. Two examples. Cars produced in Mexico by American firms, they were not included in the US GDP because this activity happens outside of the border of the United States. On the other hand, cars produced in the US by Japanese firms, they are included in the US GDP, right? So this is geographic concept. Now let's look at these practice questions. So there are two items. One, the price paid by a German tourist when staying at the New York hotel. Okay. 2, the price paid by American tourists when staying at the Berlin hotel. Okay. So the first one, the economic activity happens inside the United States, hence that included in the US GDP. But the second one, it happens in Germany. So that should count as German's GDP. Okay, so the answer is C. Now, lastly, so the GDP is in the year. Right, so GDP is like annual income. It measures a rate of production during the given period. So if you click the link here, so you will find out the current quarter's GDP data for the US economy. Okay, so this is the most latest data. Right, so you can look at here. The GDP quarter of 2020 increased by 4%. Right. Okay, so you can just dive into this web page yourself and understand the real economy. All right. To summarize, what is in and what is out. So we know what is included. Now let's just pay attention to what is not included. Intermediate goods and service. Like, say, for example, the CPU. Okay, if the CPU was purchased by a customer like you and me for our own assembling a new computer, that is a final goods. But this, if the CPU produced by Intel was purchased by Dell, that's not. Input is not, because that's going to be used to assemble another output. Used goods is not. Financial assets, they are not. Goods and service produced outside of this country, they are not. Right? So we only look at goods and service produced inside this country. Okay. So we have one further complication in reality. Okay. So there are many economic activity happened outside of the radar of the GDP accounting, like in this background picture shows. So we do lots of housekeeping ourselves. Okay, say for example, last year, so I was most time was staying at home. Actually, I fixed my sprinkler system. I also figured out how to replace the power outlet, and I replaced my dispenser in the kitchen. Okay, so those things, alternatively, I can hire a professional handyman, right? If that's the case, that should count as GDP. But because I did those jobs myself, they are not reported, or there's no actual accounting for those economic activity. So that's going to underestimate our actual GDP. But certainly, so the GDP usually doesn't include illegal transactions, right? So that just a caution of the words. So GDP is not a perfect measure of our economic activity. All right, so now let's just formally look at those measures we have discussed. The first measure is value added. So in some sense, they just repeat what I have discussed earlier by showing you this flowchart diagram. Right. So what is value added? This is the value of its sale, and then we need to subtract the value of its purchase of intermediate goods. Okay. Just give an example. Okay, and so on the right hand side, this is sales, right? So this jacket, so this sales. But in order to make these jackets, we need help of those ships, because they will provide us with high quality wool, right? And then, so if we subtract this intermediate goods, and then we get the value added. Otherwise, we will have double accounting. Okay, so you will see this double accounting through examples in next class. Okay, so wait a second. So yeah, this is value added. Now, second approach, we can look at GDP by counting all spendings. Okay, but this spending including final goods and service. Those are the goods and service sold to final or end users like you and me. Okay, so now what is intermediate goods? So goods and service that are input for production of final goods and service. Right. So this is spending approach. Right. So the other way to look at spending is, so we categorize different spending by different agents. And then, so the total spending includes 4 items. C is, C is consumer spending. Okay, like what you and me spend. And I is investment spending. Okay, like the business, they purchase new machineries. Or individuals, they purchase some durables. Like if you or your parents purchase a dishwasher, so this is going to last for a few years, and usually that's considered as investment. But if you bought some groceries, that's considered as consumer spending. Other things considered as investment is inventory. Like the early example I show you, Apple, they have 1 million unit iPhone unsold. And then, so they just put in their warehouse for future sale. That is considered as investment spending. The third big items in spending is government purchase of goods and service. Make sure you differentiate this from government transfer. And the X stands for sales to foreigners. Okay, so this is what we produce, but purchased by rest of the world. And then lastly, we have import. But why we subtract import from export? This is just find the net goods and service we produce. Because X is we produce but consumed by others, and IM is others produced but consumed by us. Okay, but this should not consider as our spending, but this should. Okay, but then we need to take the net terms, right? And to finish this part, let me show you how the actual data look like. Okay, so if we look at value added, so the biggest value added is produced by business. Households also produce some value added, and the government, right? So the government think about the national defense, think about public education. Okay. Now, if we look at expenditure approach, and then you can find out the consumer spending is the largest among all expenditures. Okay, it's more than 2/3. Okay, All right, so that is going to be the new material for today. So as I mentioned to you earlier, so we have pop quiz. Let me give you the code.